Hey, welcome to the first episode of season 4 of The Signal from the Bucks County Beacon. Yes, this is year 4 for The Signal. My name is Kevin Mahoney, and I'm usually the one sitting in the studio editing this podcast. But every once in a while, we want to get Cyril Mychalejko away from his role as the host of The Signal and hear what's happening at the Bucks County Beacon. Cyril is, of course, the editor-in-chief of the Beacon, and boy, has he been busy. And given the times that we're in, 2026 will demand independent, community-based media more than ever. Cyril, man, it's great to be sitting here with you today.
Great to see you, Kevin.
I have to say that we are off to a rapid start already in 2026. And it's all the more reason that, look, we're going to need independent, community-supported progressive media in the weeks, months, and years ahead like no time before. I feel like I've said that 1,001 times, but here we are once again. There could not be a better moment to head on over to buckscountybeacon.com, click on the Support the Beacon button, and become a supporter. You can become a regular supporter for $1 a month. $1 You can chip in $1 a month or jump right in as a regular supporter for just $5 a month, or become a yearly supporter for as little as $50 a year. Or you can drop a one-time donation to help keep the Beacon's critical lens focused and sustainable. Just go to buckscountybeacon.com, click on the Support the Beacon button, and become a supporter today. Well, Cyril, as I just alluded to there, we are off and running in 2026. But, I thought maybe before we jump into where we are and where we're going, we kind of have an opportunity to take a look back. Take a look back at 2025, because in so many ways, 2025 was a monumental year, really, for the Beacon in terms of the number of writers that have come on board, the kind of reporting that you all are doing, and really in kind of cementing the Beacon in, the kind of independent media landscape in Bucks County and beyond. So let's take a look back at 2025. I mean, we could kind of start with a piece that you published right at the end of 2025, which was the Bucks County Beacon looks back at 2025. So you gave like a top 10 articles and developments kind of at the Beacon over the year. Maybe you can kind of take us into a little bit, like, what were you thinking as you were reviewing all the work that the Beacon had done over the past year, and then thinking about what you wanted to highlight here in this piece?
Sure. I don't think it was like a traditional top 10 in the sense that we're kind of like ranking them by importance, but they were 10 stories that I really felt like helped define, the past year for not just the Beacon, but, Bucks County and politics and PA in general. I could publish another 10 stories, that we've done this past year as well, that I think would actually give some insight. But, just off the top, I think like one of the big stories, or two big stories for us as an independent news media outlet, where one was the announcement in April that the Bucks County Beacon was among nearly 50 independent newsrooms across the country named to participate in a pilot program sponsored by the Associated Press Fund for Journalism. So what the AP wanted to do is just kind of, help bolster local journalism, which is, one, it's under attack, and two, it's just disappearing, as we just saw with like the Pittsburgh Post Gazette, and then not to mention that there's just a growing number of news deserts across the country. So the idea is the pilot program was like a step in ensuring that like newsrooms like ours, have the tools to kind of, keep the public, keep our readership informed about the most pressing issues that are happening, locally, statewide, and nationally. So we had access to AP stories, AP photography, as well as guidance from the Associated Press about how to localize some of these national and state stories, something that we had been doing, previous to this partnership. So, it was really an extraordinary resource for us, because, despite the impact and reach we've had, we're still a very small newsroom,
Right.
right? I mean, even the Bucks County Courier Times, which is just like a shell of what it was like 20 years ago when it had like dozens of staffers, even them with, maybe 6 to 8 regular reporters that they have, that dwarfs us. It's myself as the editor, and then, Melinda Rizzo as our, staff writer. And then, of course, we have about a dozen freelance writers who write for us consistently. And we're bringing on new writers as well, which we can talk about
Yeah.
much later. But again, like that was just, that was a huge win for the Beacon, and it was kind of like a validation to kind of be recognized by, the oldest news organization in the United States, to have them recognize our value and want to invest in the work that we do locally.
I really like this list, and especially that lead off one here with the stuff on the APs is one of the things I've been really appreciating that both you and Emily both have been doing all throughout this process is sharing the more of the behind the scenes stuff every once in a while, because one of the also things that we've lost, right, as you say, is newsrooms become kind of, shells of their former selves, to really an understanding, a community based understanding of like what actually goes into keeping a newsroom sustainable and solid. Was one thing when you had large newsrooms in small towns, large towns all around, where you had reporters that you knew, right, because they lived in your town. Like, people worked at the printing presses, people worked at the newsrooms, as part of that, as a pillar of a community. And as that has become, dwindled down to just a few kind of employees, just people's understanding of actually what goes into creating a viable and sustainable independent newsroom, it has kind of gone by the wayside, like so many of our other institutions. So I think it's really cool that, taking us that behind the scenes here and really saying, whoa, you got the Associated Press. They're trying to step up and highlight stuff. But again, you say there are 50 newsrooms across the country. So that's even a limited amount. And the fact that the Beacon kind of stood out among them and they're getting the support has been phenomenal. And it's been showing in the reporting too that comes up.
Yeah, and just to kind of, continue on with what you just said about like building the infrastructure of a local newsroom, that's something that, we've taken another step forward with, after this AP partnership, in October. We hired Darylise Lyons as our chief revenue officer, and she's tasked with continuing to build out the financial infrastructure that makes sure that the Bucks County Beacon is here for the long haul. And she's extraordinary. It's just been so wonderful working with her. She had a similar position, and then was also like publisher and editor of the Chestnut Hill Local. And she's just been doing really great work, kind of with community outreach, talking to folks in the community, making connections, getting us grants. And I'm really excited to see how she helps us grow over these next couple years, as she's kind of making her magic happen by just doing the work. And she's a grinder. She hustles. I mean, she's just out there constantly, kind of like, sending me ideas for stories based on like conversations she had with people that she's talked to, applying for different grants for different journalism projects that that we'll be able to take on to continue to, you know, provide readers with the stories that matter most to them about how they're going to impact local democracy, local school boards, local elections, etc. So I'm really excited, just based on those two things. And the Associated Press also just got more grant money to continue this program. So we'll be continuing on with them through 2026. And they'll also, which I think is great for the country, be bringing on other newsrooms as well.
Absolutely, and the great quote from Darrell in your piece there is like, "I have always been passionate about scrappy startup cultures and being in places where I feel empowered to make a difference." Well, landed in the right place. That's for sure. I thought it was a great description of what the Beacon has been and continues to be. So that's super.
Yeah, she's a perfect fit. She really is for the culture of the Beacon and what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and so then as you kind of think about some of the stories, because on the one hand, we got the kind of the lens of what's like been happening at the Beacon to really kind of shore up this institution. I thought your selection of some of the let's see articles and the different focuses you had for this 10 these 10 stories of the year really helped give shape to the community itself, both in terms of these larger forces like external to Bucks County, right? You know, that we'd see at the national, international level and their impact in our backyards, literally, right? To ones that are much more organically focused right here in Bucks County. The kind of stories that, like you pointed to, that maybe other newspapers at the time, once upon a time, would have been covered on a regular basis, but are now just kind of left by the wayside because there's not staffing. Yet the Beacon is there to highlight those stories too.
Sure. I mean, I think one story that I really appreciated and that signals what we're going to continue to focus on in 2026 is just these, these AI data centers. This is something that we're
Yeah.
seeing across the country. And, again, that's, we're ground zero, and it's hit close to home as it was announced in June that Amazon's bringing one to Falls Township. Naomi Weiss, who was our extraordinary summer intern.
Yeah, she was
Yeah.
pretty impressive. I gotta say.
Uh, yeah, I'm waiting for her to graduate to try to get her, to hire her on full time.
No kidding.
Um, she's from Yardley. She's a junior at the University of Pittsburgh, and she did a great story about kind of like really critiquing and then giving a voice to some of the concerns about what the consequences of having a data center like this might be. Because no, locally, everyone was kind of like, had their pom poms out cheering like jobs, jobs, right, and including Governor Shapiro, right. It's
Yep.
kind of like since then, kind of, it seems at least taken a step back from his embrace, of AI data centers and this kind of like AI infrastructure. Or he's being careful with his messaging because what we're seeing is that like across Pennsylvania, and we've reported about this as well via AP or State Line. Communities are one concerned and two upset because three, the whole process is surprise, not very transparent. It's about how these deals are being brokered, how taxpayers are going to be on the hook, what the energy costs are going to be, the environmental consequences, the water usage, etc. So this is something that Naomi did a wonderful job kind of writing about and kind of like setting the table, but it's really it's been quiet locally so far. I've had a couple like local people reach out to me, ask me for more resources, but I'm going to be assigning someone to kind of like take on this story in the next few months to do a series of articles. We might even co-host or sponsor, a couple teach-ins in Lower Bucks about, what exactly this means for the local community, and what people should kind of prepare for looking forward. Because I think it would be, a mistake if the folks in Falls Township don't start organizing around this now, start showing up to the township meetings, and just kind of like making sure that they're being vigilant as next steps are made to require or request that that there's like kind of like guardrails and proper like oversight with like teeth if things
Right.
don't don't go the way that local ordinances or hopefully state laws in Harrisburg, if the state house and senate can kind of agree on setting some parameters and setting some and passing legislation that makes sure that if there are going to be these data centers, that one, it's not going to just devastate the environment, that two, it's not going to just take money out of people's pockets because of skyrocketing electricity costs. And I think this is something that there should be bipartisan consensus on, right? And I'm hopeful moving forward that maybe we will see some movement, in Harrisburg, with some statewide laws, and then locally the township and county level as well, to ensure that these data centers just don't get to run roughshod over the communities at their expense.
Yeah, and I think this comes out a bit in Naomi Weiss's piece on that you're referring to. And I also think that this is such a good role for the Beacon to be covering this too as well, because in some ways the data centers are being presented as these part of that the 21st century, like going future and all this stuff, but at their core it's like a very Pennsylvania story. It's just like the coal mines, it's just like fracking, it's the same extractivist mentality that they're going in with, just being replayed in these quote unquote clean data centers. And I think that's why Shapiro got so kind of roped into this, because he used to be, and probably still is, kind of connected to those high tech folks that at one point were supporters of the Democratic Party, and it was this new kind of clean version of who the Democrats can be, stepping away from labor, moving towards this kind of high tech stuff. But really, it's just the same thing as we see what happened this past year with all the kind of big tech giants. Yeah, they showed their true colors. And these data centers are really just basically taking Pennsylvania right back to where we just saw the fracking fight go, right? Going into communities, extracting all their resources, causing all those people in those communities to kind of suffer the kind of major consequences of them, and then eventually kind of move on and throw them away. I mean, that's been the model of Pennsylvania extractivism throughout its
Yeah, and,
history.
and I think Shapiro has tried to govern as, in my opinion, kind of like a pro-business Democrat. He had this like lightning plan about like streamlining energy infrastructure projects, which I think can, which was called like the lightning speed plan. Like, I'm not sure we want,
Yeah.
these big energy giants doing anything at lightning speed, because their track record suggests that they're going to be polluting at lightning speed, trying to cover it up at lightning speed, and keeping like public, oversight and accountability out at lightning speed. And I think that's why, like, one of the stories we talked about was like fracking's broken promises to Pennsylvania. Like, there's Exhibit A, and he's had a mixed record on that, right? He had, when he was AG, he was trying to hold them accountable out in Dimmock, based on the water pollution. But we've seen, fracking was supposed to be this, wave this magic
Yep.
wand that was just going to like transform Pennsylvania into not just an energy giant, but make it energy independent. We haven't seen that, but what we have seen are just like toxic cocktails contaminating our waterways, and radioactive waste left to poison the environment. And the publication who we've partnered with, Inside Climate News, has done
They're
tremendous
great.
work
Yeah.
around that, and it was their work that I highlighted in this 10 stories of 2025 list, because they've just done a tremendous job dedicating the resources and having their great reporters like Kylie Bentz just really unearth, so to speak, exactly what fracking's record has been in Pennsylvania, and what it's left behind this past decade or two.
Yeah, and really, they've been an outstanding organization doing the same kind of stuff that the Beacon has set out to do, right? I mean, it's like they go on the ground, they're talking to people, they're, spend resources to spend times in those communities to uncover this, and then are doing the research and kind of the background and situating it within a larger picture. I mean, it's just really outstanding reporting, and to see that kind of, again, this is one of the other phenomenal partnerships that the Beacon has had with Inside Climate News to really expand that conversation around, this kind of extractivism, impacts on the environment, and so on.
So I think just one more story to stick on the environment. We have
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
a new features writer, Lee Davis. She's based in Doylestown. She did a really wonderful piece called "Saving Plumstead." A rural Bucks County township stands together to preserve their piece of paradise. And
Great.
it was just some wonderful reporting. She went there, got to talk to a lot of the people that were at the forefront of organizing the community around a proposed solid waste, quote unquote, recycling plant that had initially been slated for a mile away from Plumstead Town Square. And this was an example where, like, kind of partisan politics took a back seat, and you saw kind of like Democrats and Republicans work together, because there was just like a common threat to to their homes, right? And so I just thought, one, I just love her writing. And
I love that piece too as well, because it's like a lot of times those kind of fights, right, will get lumped into this, the NIMBY people, like, not in my backyard, but just do it someplace else. But by the reporting of actually talking to people and hearing them talking about their homes and talking about their communities, then you start to consider what's at stake. You're outside of this kind of either or, easy, sets of boxes, but you start talking about what makes this community matter. And it seems like in that story, it's also, you get to see the community. I don't want to overstate it, but, like, kind of healing some kind of rifts that may have been interjected from these national politics, right? Where people are actually focused on what matters in Plumstead. Very much what happened around the school board races
yeah,
throughout
no,
Bucks County.
absolutely. Let's go through a couple more, I guess. I mean, one
Yeah.
is just, there was news that broke that the Peace Center was shutting down, which the Peace Center has been an institution in Bucks County for decades, and that is until our own kind of version of Superwoman, Barbara Simmons, who used to run the Peace Center, stepped in and said, "No, I can't let this happen. Not now. This is not the moment." The Peace Center is needed now more than ever. Even though Barbara stepped away, some years back, she's still been active in the community around school board issues, around immigration issues. And she's just a long time peace activist who's been doing peace work for decades. So, there is a big sigh of relief as well as a celebration that, she announced that she was coming out of retirement, to kind of fill this role. And she's been kind of running around like crazy the last couple months, ensuring that they can kind of like raise the funds and restart some projects. They'll have the Martin Luther King Teen Summit coming up this weekend. I'm looking forward to seeing her kind of rejuvenate, and kind of regrow the Bucks County Peace Center, and to just really continue to be a place where voices are raised that need to be heard, in defense of, civil rights, in defense of racial justice, in defense of inclusivity. So yes, that was a story by Aaron Flynn Jay, and the title of that is "Bucks County's Peace Center Isn't Going Anywhere," and thank God for that.
Yeah. Well, see these community-based organizations, right, that are often the memory for activists across generations. I remember, when I spent years in Syracuse, and there was a Syracuse Peace Center, right, and there's still the Syracuse cultural workers are still up there, the ones who produce all the bumper stickers and T-shirts you can find everywhere. Right? But and the Peace Center was one of these places that sometimes it was run by like 2-3 people who were just kind of keeping it going through the kind of like the thin times. But when issues came up, they were there once again, and there was like a huge, like, records and background and experience, and that was available there for the community. Like, so I remember, our little punk rock selves back in Syracuse were like, we want to get involved. Like, well, nobody's doing anything, like as kids do, right? And then you find out, oh, actually, there's these kind of like these olds, right? There's these olds over there that have got this thing, and they invited us into this space, right? Not to kind of like tell us what to, but as to kind of like be part of this community, provide free space for community-based meetings where we can meet with other folks and start talking about stuff. And that's that role, like same kind of stuff here with the Peace Center. Everyone I've talked to about the Peace Center in Bucks County has been like, yeah, I mean, they've been here forever. I mean, that's what you hear again and again. They've always been
Yeah, I
here,
mean,
been
back
here
back when
forever.
I was writing a column for the Courier Times, which now seems like 100 years ago, I actually wrote about their history and kind of how it started. And the Peace Center actually began as part of the anti-nuke movement in the early '80s. And so, Paul Zimmerman, who was from Upper Makefield Township, he was a screenwriter who he passed away in '93, but he helped start the Bucks Alliance for Nuclear Disarmament, or BAND, right? And what had happened was, like, he wrote this 1982 film, The King of Comedy, which
Oh
was
yeah,
directed by Martin
yeah, yeah.
Scorsese, had De Niro and Jerry Lewis in it, and he used a lot of the money that he made from that to start Band, right? Which started with about 40 people and then blossomed into a group of hundreds of members, and 20 church and secular organizations advocating for a nuclear freeze at the time of height of the Cold War, in the early '80s, with Reagan, and who knew what the hell he was capable of doing. And then from there, that's kind of like it pivoted to just become an organization that had a broader mission beyond just anti-nuclear organizing.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, and again, one of these stories that just is nowhere to be found in any other reporting that we've been seeing on here other than the Bucks County Beacon. Yeah,
And
I
then
was looking at some of the, I mean, there's so much that happened too as well, right? Over the past of this year that the Beacon was there kind of like on the ground for really kind of key things. Like one, whether it was covering developments at the state level about, again, a great piece about threats to reproductive rights that were kind of going forward. You had photo essays of people on the grounds during the protests that were taking place. I mean, the No Kings protests, just for an example. But yeah, I mean, just great stories on those things too as well.
Yeah, we've been fortunate to have some great photographers do work for us, whether it's David Iskra and Lower Bucks, or Mike Maney and Kevin Crawford and Central Bucks. And so they've really kind of really helped grow our photo
Yeah, and
reportage
Amy
of
Connect. I
what's
know Amy
happening on the
Connect was doing
ground.
some. Yeah,
And
was doing stuff for you guys up
Upper
here. Yeah,
Bucks,
exactly. Yep.
absolutely. So yeah, and I guess one major story that, excuse me, that we kind of broke actually, and that really kind of like, I think it really, in a way, it really defined what was happening on the ground in Bucks County. In the 6 months or so leading up to the blue wave election, was Sheriff Fred Horan's decision to sign a partnership, a 287G task force model partnership with ICE, right? Essentially inviting ICE to the communities and neighborhoods of Bucks County, something not unpredictably, but thankfully was met with, or not unsurprisingly, but thankfully was met with like fierce resistance locally, up and down Bucks
Yeah.
County. From Immigrant Rights Action to Bucks NAACP to local churches to students. It was just, one, I guess I wasn't shocked that Haran tried this. He had tried it before in Bensalem back in 2019. He was met with community outrage then, and they had to drop it because of that. But he thought maybe
Time was
he was
right.
in a new Yeah, the time was right when a new MAGA
Right.
moment, right? And that he was going to go ahead and do this anyway, even though there's really no need for it. Because, as Danny Seisler, our new sheriff, had pointed out, is like, you don't need to have these agreements or have ICE on the ground here to transport people from like the prisons who are kind of who are arrested or convicted of like violent crimes. And what that agreement would just do is just it was an invitation for just kind of disaster, racial profiling, civil rights violations, never mind like maybe the potential murder of of a local Bucks County
Right.
protester who might be out kind of trying to just voice their first amendment rights to free speech, saying like, no, we don't want ICE here, we don't want ICE raiding our schools, our hospitals, our churches, we don't want ICE snatching people from courtrooms who are going through like legal processes to get their citizenship or residency, as we've seen across the
Right.
country, like from New York City to Los Angeles to Philadelphia. And this was really just something that brought the community together and said like, enough, like we don't want this here. And I think that was part of the reason why Haran lost his race.
Yep.
What was it, by 10,000 or
Something like
15,000
that.
votes?
Yeah.
And other numbers, 10 percentage points.
Which is, yeah.
And
I
he's
was going to
still
say, I'm
in
glad you said the
denial.
percentage points, because I'm like, which was,
Yeah,
that's a not insignificant amount. Like, that was a big loss, a huge loss.
overwhelming.
Yes.
And what's interesting is he's still in denial. Like he still refuses to admit that like ICE was unpopular. I was listening
Just a blue wave.
to
What are you going to do? I got caught up in the wave.
well, and yeah, he said that, and as well as like I think right before Christmas, I was listening to another interview that he gave with Dom Giordano, local MAGA radio mouth on AM radio, and he blamed abortion, right? So he said it was like the state Supreme Court race that did him in.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So
It was all the witchcraft done with the aborted fetuses that somehow kind of get whatever weird that he wants to say. Oh my god, yeah, that piece was amazing. And I also, again, it's this. I've always got, talked about when I'm, whether it's in my classes where I'm teaching about kind of activism in media and things like this, or over the years working in this kind of like progressive activist media space, about the importance of being able to have a community see itself in the mirror, right? And a few things, like, not only did the Beacon highlight this issue and bring in those voices of people that were also like really really concerned about this, but then by having this kind of being picked up, it was picked up by MSNBC, became a national story, there was reporting on it, then suddenly that it's kind of an affirmation for the community itself, right? To kind of, yes, we can actually, yes, other people see this as a significant problem too as well, and it helps bolster that kind of resistance. I mean, one of the images that you included with the story, you've got Chris Hayes there and MSNBC with the Beacon headline highlighted, right, to pointing to the reporting in the Beacon, and it's like this way the community says, yes, this is why we need to, one, continue to support places like the Beacon, because now we see this gets picked up and this is serious, but also bolstering the community itself, right, in its own organizing efforts. So,
yeah, and it just that we've had a national audience for a long time, and it
yep,
continues to grow. Like you'll find our reporting in other places, from Chris Hayes, MSNBC, to The Nation, to Salon, right, to In These Times, and so all eyes are on Bucks County, and I feel like the Bucks County Beacon is the media outlet that is always going to have put the resources into these kind of important stories nationally, whether it's about school board issues, to immigration, etc. And yeah, and I think like this ICE story, was very kind of indicative of not just local but like national discontent about like the Trump regime's overreach, with what they're with what they're planning to do to kind of militarize society. I think DHS recently put out a tweet suggesting that they wanted to deport I think it was 100 million people from the
Yeah.
country. Well, there's only 150 million people of color in the United States. I mean, what they're advocating
Yeah.
for essentially is ethnic cleansing, right? Um, so
Absolutely.
yeah,
Well, maybe that story, that breaking story broke the story around Fred Herron and the role the beacon played in the election is a good like pivot point for us at this point to kind of connect to that. I mean, because of course ICE is this. I mean, is been in the news lately after a killing, a woman in Minnesota, Minneapolis, and they do not seem to have that has not seemed to have deterred them at all. As a matter of fact, they seem to be ramping up efforts. There was just video that's emerging this morning, for example, of a woman having her car. She was going up to get gas at a gas station, have the window smashed and dragged from her car. I mean, they're up, and there are all these masked agents that are out there. But it's like, so we've got the ICE, ICE in full kind of militia. I heard this discussion the other day. I said, "Well, are they? They're like the brown shirts." And the I think it was on Sam Cedars Majority Report saying, "Yeah, but you know what? The brown shirt or the guy who was on, or they were interviewing, is like, yeah, but the brown shirts were more informal. This is like
yeah,
state sponsored, militarized, like organized, state supported thing. Has the largest kind of budget of more than many militaries and countries around the world, right? It has a bigger budget than our FBI." Right, so we've got that as kind of in the like in one of the brightly blazing spotlights right now. Well, we also have now like the capture of a foreign leader through an assault Maduro in Venezuela and kind of going after their oil in Venezuela. Right, we have now Trump saying that like Iran is going to pay because now something like 2,500 people have been confirmed dead, right, in the protest against the Iranian regime right now, saying now we're going to go after kind of Iran and threatening them. We see there's talks in DC today about whether the US is going to take over Greenland, right? And it just sits as like, yeah, this is what kind of empire of mob rule looks like in this kind of way. And then, of course, 2026, we've got like midterm elections coming up. And so, I mean, if you are put us in this moment right now, like how do you kind of see where we're at? And then I'm really interested about how you're thinking about moving.
sure. I mean, the ICE thing is horrifying, but it's not shocking, right? Like since its inception, especially like the 287G program, it's been riddled with like civil rights violations, like dating back to like Sheriff Joe
Yeah.
Arpaio in Arizona is like the perfect example, right? Where the Department of Justice had to step in, and like that's part of the reason why the Obama administration suspended it. And I was doing some reading and some research, after the shooting, and the Nation had an article which was back in 2014, and they were reporting on a piece in the LA Times which had gotten access to an internal review of the Border Patrol's use of force policies. Again, this was back in 2014. This is just some of the highlights of what they found back then. Quote, Border Patrol agents have intentionally and unnecessarily stepped in front of moving cars to justify using deadly force against vehicle occupants. Where have we seen that? Oh, right, in
Renee Nicole
Minneapolis just
Good.
now.
There we go.
And now a woman's dead. Yes, Renee Good. Agents have shot in frustration across the border at rock throwers when simply moving away was an option. Border Patrol demonstrates a lack of diligence in investigating incidents in which U.S. agents fire their weapons. It's questionable whether Border Patrol consistently and thoroughly reviews incidents in which agents use deadly force. While what's happening is horrifying, Trump isn't really ICE under Trump isn't really such an anomaly or an aberration,
Right.
right? And I think that theme actually can kind of like step towards the other, one of the other topics you talked about was the coup in Venezuela, right? The Trump administration, after, you know, assassinating poor fishermen in this like new, 21st century gunboat
Yeah.
diplomacy, um, after over, you know, after overthrowing the Venezuelan government, at least taking out its leader, going in there, in violation of international law, while the United States is under no, immediate threat, which is the only reason that would warrant that. They kidnapped that leader, and a lot of people were saying like, you know, this goes against like American values, like people I respect and who I like and whose opinions I often agree with, but there's a sense like it's like we're in this like perpetual state of amnesia, like we've never seen this before. It's
Just
just
not
like, yes, we
right.
have. Like this is as American as apple pie,
Right.
right? I mean, if we're just like looking at Latin America, I mean, you could go to like the CIA overthrowing the Guatemalan government in 1954, largely at the behest of United Fruit
Yep.
Company, right? You have the U.S. overthrowing the Chilean government in 1973, through the CIA, after destabilizing the country because like Nixon and Kissinger, wanted to make the economy scream, right, in order to create the conditions where there is turmoil and a coup.
Aided
You
by
had
aided by the Chicago school Milton Friedman, by the way, of laying out the plans for their economic transformation. Just had to throw that in.
exactly. And then, like the Reagan years, Saint Ronald, palling around with genocidal dictators like Rios Montt, funding, training, and arming death squads in El Salvador who raped and killed nuns and assassinated priests like Archbishop Oscar Romero. Maybe like if we're looking at what the American public wants, like, maybe this is like against like, I would like to think a majority of Americans' values, right? But it's, as far as governments have gone, American administrations, this is just like, old wine, new bottle, right? Just, a new Trump label on it. And I think just like, Trump is just kind of, just really unapologetic against this like naked aggression and projection of like U.S. power abroad, whereas maybe we would try, in the past they would try to kind of, cloak it around, democracy building or like the U.S. Cold War.
Exactly. And I actually had this conversation with somebody the other day who said, look, it's just like when Bush kind of Bush invaded Iraq and thing. I said, but think about the one significant difference here, right? This is why I kind of think about like mob empire is really the way that we need to think about this, right? And I've said this before Trump's first election. I remember when we first started kind of the Raging Chicken podcast back in the day when Sean Kitchen and I were kind of doing that stuff, saying like best way of understanding what's happening with Trump is to look at how the mob functions, right? That's what it is, right? At its core, Putin works in the same way, right? So in some way, and this is kind of consistent with authoritarianism and fascism, blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. But I'm like, really, that's kind of what's going on. The only difference is that, well, the two significant differences are, one, just what you said, right? Just kind of so blatant. We're just going to kind of like rip off all the kind of niceties. We're just going to do this out in the open, right? So you can't expose a scandal because I've just told you what we're doing, right? Yeah. And then on the other hand, the difference with the Bush regime, right, as again, broke international law, did all sorts of things like that, but they still felt they needed, right, to have some sort of legal justification, right? They had to have a coalition of the willing, right, as a way of trying to fracturing international law. Whereas this is just like, no, we're just going to go and freaking bomb shit, kill people, and then we're going to say that, yep, they're bad people and prove otherwise. That's it.
And he admitted we're just going to take the oil.
Yeah, we're just going to take the oil. And then he convenes like a conference of oil executives and say, okay, let's talk about how we're going to divvy this shit up. I mean, it's remarkable.
Yeah, it's more like a kind of smash and grab, like mafia imperialism, like mob imperialism. I'm not sure what the overarching, or if there's any kind of like overarching geopolitical strategy other than like, we're going to take your shit.
No, but
Right?
that's the consistent thing, right? It's the only thing, the only operating principle is power accrued to the center, right? To Trump and his immediate cronies, right? Everything else is just a tool to be manipulated and kind of worked around in order to accomplish that end. Self enrichment, kind of concentration of power, right? I was just reading some of this stuff on Greenland. I'm just fascinated by the Greenland thing. For exactly this reason, right? And they're using this Danish intelligence report as a way of justifying the reason why the U.S. needs to take like Greenland by any by any means necessary, because Greenland's like again. Greenland and the Danish, or sorry, the report come out of the Danish Foreign Ministry, but it's not. They weren't saying help, help, help. We're going to about be taken over, but they just basically say, hey, look, the U.S., Russia, and China, these all seem to have starting to think about like interest in the Arctic and increased activity. Why? Well, because we said screw global warming, and that's going to warm up, and now people are after minerals and all this other kinds of stuff. And so they mentioned the United States, and the United States needs to have these joint actions with NATO to make sure these things are in check. So now they're bandering that around, like see, even kind of the Danish folks are saying that the U.S. is the only one that can handle this. I mean, it's incredible. But really, they don't care about that document. All they care about is being say, hey, look, we can use this. It's like it's like kids in school who want to make an argument, right? They've already reached a conclusion, and so they go out to try to find sources that kind of they can plug in that suits that argument, regardless of what kind of like oppositional stuff they've got, and they go ahead and do that. And it's happening over and over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to become, if we're not already, seen as an international pariah, right? And at some point, I wonder if the United Nations, has to have a meeting about what to do about the United States, right? We're in violation of the UN Charter. Yeah. And, I think that like that's part of, I think that is one like goal of, the Trump, regime, is that, they just want to blow up the international order. Right. That's why they've withdrawn from 60 international agencies and treaties. Right. And this, if they do invade Greenland, that would just blow up NATO. And as imperfect as like the UN and NATO is, God, it scares me thinking about a world without that.
Yeah, 100%. So we've got this kind of scenario. 2026 has gotten off to a really disturbing start. I mean, before we got on the air today, you were saying something along the lines of like, yeah, well, so much for this being a banner year, right? like turn over the new leaf for the new year. I mean, it really right out of the, right out of the gate. I think we've been shown that 2026 is going to require our vigilance, organization, and attention kind of even to match, if not even further, what we just saw this past year. So, I was, already you can see this happening in the pages of the Beacon, just in terms of like the range of stories are already being covered, what folks are kind of looking at. But I'm kind of curious from where you sit now as you're kind of looking for this year ahead. What are the kinds of ways that you think about approaching this, right? And approaching this kind of coming year, especially with midterm elections coming on, and what are the kind of plans that you may already have about the stories that you really want to focus on, or ways that you want to, further serve the community?
Yeah, it's really dire right now. I mean, people's lives are at stake, whether it's, a woman like Renee Good, at caught in the middle of an ICE immigration sweep, whether it's someone losing their health care, because they can no longer afford it, or they got kicked off of Medicaid, or if it's just someone in a foreign country, right? I mean, we talk about the kidnapping of Maduro and his wife, but we often forget that there's maybe close to 100 people that were also killed when they attacked Caracas, And then you have guys like Elliot Abrams. Just to pivot a
Yeah, yeah,
second, but
yeah.
you know, I mean, Elliot Abrams is like a former like Reagan administration official in the '80s. The kind of like right in the middle of all that crap that we were talking about in like Central America. I mean, he just gave an interview for the New York Times, talking about Venezuela, and he's just talking about killing
Yeah.
more people,
Yep.
like more leaders in the regime. And somehow this is normal. And somehow, like, they'll spend an hour talking to someone like a warmonger, like Elliot Abrams, like, someone who denied that the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador actually happened. But they're not giving any like voices, they're not giving that time to any kind of like voices of peace, never mind sanity, right? Or never mind people who just think, hey, let's just follow international law. So sorry about
No,
that
no,
little
no, but that fits.
detour.
But that fits right in. I mean, that fits right exactly in with this kind of mentality. And I also say one of the problems with the reporting on those things, right? I mean, this is one of the things where the Beacon has been so sharply focused and with a kind of like ethical and moral core to how you approach the news, right? Like it's so for like what's been infuriating to me to see the coverage that we've seen just in the few weeks that we've had so far in 2026 is like both with Venezuela and with Greenland stuff to see headlines and stories focus on, well, the administration's argument for why to proceed in this way is based upon. I'm like, it's not based on anything. And so the
Yeah.
reporters are still stuck in this idea that, like, well, let's look at both sides of the argument and what's the most reasonable case being made by the Trump administration for this kind of. I'm like, you people have, I'm like, what's it going to take to really say, like, wait a minute, if we were, to go back to what you said about, people, this is not American values anymore. And I think it's like one, not, it speaks to the failure of the American educational system, but that's for another story. But it also kind of speaks to, I think, what people want to see themselves as, right? And those sets of values say, if we're a beacon for democracy, right? And you and I could show you multiple reasons about way that have violated these international rules over and over and over again. But if that's what we want to see ourselves, right, then those are the values by which you need to judge these actions at the very least, right? If law is supposed to be anything that's about serving people, not the powerful, right, then you need to kind of hold them to the letter of this law, not kind of like saying, well, let's see what they're saying about this and say, well, who knows what the truth is. But there's my own little diatribe for you. I'm going to move it in there.
And if anyone wants to just read a book, about like America's history of regime change, check out of the library or buy at your local bookstore Overthrow: America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq, which was written by Stephen Kinzer, who's just a phenomenal author and journalist. And, he also wrote a book about the Guatemalan coup that I mentioned called Bitter
Yeah.
Fruit, which really explored United Fruit Company's role in that. But so, like, you had asked about
Yeah.
us like moving forward. It is about like kind of like our continuing our reporting and our mission to kind of like elevate and amplify, voices and voices of dissent that are often, either intentionally left out or marginalized in mainstream, media reporting. And just to kind of, not just like report on something like once and just leave it at that, to kind of do like follow up and follow up and follow up on that follow up, on issues like the data center, or like what Melinda Rizzo did, with the sheriff's ICE 287G program, the lawsuit, the actions, etc. And we're going to continue like talking to people in the community, asking them like, hey, what is it that you want us to report on as well? And in addition to kind of like the stories that myself or our growing list of journalists have on their radar. But I mean, a lot of it is just about rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like women's rights, civil rights, free speech rights, international rights and norms, really kind of like focusing on like how a lot of these how a lot of some of these big picture issues impact folks in Bucks County, like whether it's through like, healthcare, or like, starting local and kind of like, moving out from there with, whether it's like how school districts are incorporating AI into the classroom and into their pedagogy,
Yeah.
um, among other things.
That's quite a task you have before us. That's for sure. So, anything that you want to highlight of things upcoming in the Beacon that people can one. I know everybody's been on break. I certainly have been. The holidays and all that kind of stuff. So kinds of things you can go back and go to the buckscountybeacon.com, go catch up on all the great work there. But what should have people be looking forward to seeing come in, both whether on the podcast or in the pages of the Beacon?
Sure. In the podcast one, I mean, we already have scheduled a few different interviews, one of which will be some of the Democratic candidates for the PA1 congressional seat. So obviously this is a huge story. Like, Brian Fitzpatrick has been a foil for the local Democratic Party for years. Every chance or every attempt they've made to unseat him has kind of failed and failed. I think it's appropriate to say pretty miserably. Maybe what was the closest one was like Scott Wallace, and that was like a 3%, loss. So given the political situation in the country, Brian Fitzpatrick is vulnerable, right? And you have 4 candidates running for office right now. But I would be lying to you if I didn't say that Bob Harvey is the front runner. Like, there's no way to get around that. The other candidates might not like that, but that's the truth. Bob Harvey has the roots in Bucks County. Bob Harvey has the name recognition in Bucks County. Bob Harvey, has won and held elected offices, including, Bucks County Commissioner, which is what he is right now. I'm not saying like people shouldn't run against him, and they shouldn't, kind of add to the debate and conversation. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility that someone else, could just shock the world in Bucks County and win. But, Bob Harvey, moving ahead, he's the person to unseat for those other 3 candidates. And he has the endorsements and some, you do need money to run, right? Like, unfortunately, we don't have publicly funded elections. So yeah, this race is going to be huge. So we're going to talk to, I want to talk to the other candidates.
Well, I think, well, yeah, and this is awesome that you're going to have the other candidates on the podcast, and it's also the reason why I hope Harvey's campaign also decides they want to continue to show up for town halls and debates and things like this, because ultimately, this is where primaries are a good thing, right? Even if Bob Harvey is the kind of that, like, he's the front runner, like even if he ends up getting the nod, those primaries are only going to make all those candidates better candidates. Right. And it's going to put more of a spotlight on the message and the event. So, for anybody out there who's a naysayer about saying, oh, there shouldn't be anybody else. Well, look, you got to look at it as a primary process, as part of practicing democracy. Right. And as the way that candidates get they cut their teeth on this kind of campaign ahead of the main election in the fall. So I was excited to see multiple people running, even though I'm under no illusions about like Harvey's strength as a candidate. But this is going to be, I think, a really interesting and important process for all of Bucks County.
Yeah, and I will say one thing is like Bob Harvey is putting himself out there. He's hosting town halls up and down the county, up in your parts to lower Bucks. So yeah, and then in addition to that, I'm going to have the author Laura Beers. She wrote a book last year called Orwell's Ghosts: Wisdom and Warnings for the 21st Century, and that's something I'm reading right now, and it's amazing and scarily relevant, given the times that we're living in right now and the way that this regime behaves, with its just unencumbered lying, just like, don't believe your lying eyes, right? So it's just like, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation with both with Laura, with the candidates. I want to talk to Tim Hayes, who's Dublin Borough Council. That's Dublin and Bucks County, not in
Yeah,
Ireland.
yeah, he's a great candidate. I've met him. He's been to some
He's
local. He's
super. He's
really
sharp.
really sharp. And he's got, and
So
again, he cut his teeth in the Dublin Borough Council. They've done great work there. Couldn't be more excited about his candidacy.
yeah, he'll be running against Shelby Labs as well. I believe
Yep.
she'll be running for re-election, I think. So yeah, and then in addition to that, for the 20th, we're going to have a package of articles where Bucks County Voices, Bucks County Beacon Voices are looking back at the Trump administration's first year. So we'll have like Tabitha Delangelo. She's written a piece about the Trump administration's impact on K through 12 education. Adrian King, the Bucks County NAACP president, will be writing a piece for us. Yourself,
Hey.
we'll hear from Kevin about the administration's war on higher education. Molly Parzin, who writes a monthly column for us. She's the executive director of Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, and many more. So that'll be something to look forward to on the 20th. And then I'm in the works of talking to a few people that I'd had on the podcast before, the authors of the U.S. Anti-Fascism Reader. I think I want to try to kind of work with them to come up with a project, some kind of like monthly series about anti-fascism education, anti-fascist organizing, because the threat we face is real, right? I mean, we have, a masked, unaccountable, military or paramilitary force. I don't know what you want to call it in ICE. The Trump administration has weaponized the FBI
And
and
the
the
Justice
National
Department. Yeah.
Guard. The DOJ. I mean, just a bunch of lawyers quit because now Trump wanted to investigate Renee Good's widowed wife, and there's Chuck Schumer just gave an interview with the Associated Press that was published this morning, saying that they're worried about the Trump administration's interference in elections, and that's not beyond the realm of possibility. And Trump has already kind of said that he was jealous is the right word, or envious of Zelensky, because he didn't have to have elections because he was in a war. So, we'll see what that means moving forward. But yeah, so those are just a few of the things that you'll see in the Bucks County Beacon moving forward, as well as we're bringing in new writers as well, like Elena Johns, who just had a really great piece. She's the editor of the Broad Street Review, and she's a freelance journalist and a disabled freelancer. And she wrote this really excellent piece about what the Affordable Care Act means for disabled freelancers like herself, and what losing that health care because of potentially, if the Senate doesn't pass the House bill to extend the ACA subsidies for 3 more years, what that would mean for disabled workers like herself. Never mind just everyday folks that in Bucks County and beyond.
Well, there's certainly a lot on the plate, Cyril. I know the Beacon is prepared for it and is preparing, continues to build for it. I just want to give a shout out to everyone out there who has stepped up to help support the Beacon, who's shared articles I see kind of in the Beacon, who sent leads to people, suggested stories. All of you in the community have really rallied around the Beacon as the go-to place to support the work that, people are doing in their communities on the ground to try to not only defend our communities from these kind of like attacks and kind of right-wing developments and ICE agents and all the stuff, but also to build the organizations that are going to be necessary to getting us through and then getting us past and then articulating a vision for the future. So thanks to all of you who are listening to this podcast and who are supporting the Beacon out there. That's for sure. And the last thing I want to say is like, look, if it hasn't been clear from today's podcast, we're really going to need the Bucks County Beacon going forward. And so if you can, head on over to the buckscountybeacon.com, click on the support the beacon button and become a supporter. You can become an entry-level supporter for as little as $1 a month. Jump in as a regular supporter for $5 a month, or a yearly supporter for as little as $50 a year. You can also drop a one-time donation to keep the Beacon's critical lens focused and sustainable. Just go to the buckscountybeacon.com, click on that support the beacon button, and become a supporter today. Well, Cyril, as always, it's both a joy and sobering, and a sobering moment to kind of talk to you about the world today. It's like this weird mix of both the hope and encouragement for the work that's happening at the Beacon, at the same time, a recognition that we are in truly dire times, which is going to need us all to be there. But I couldn't ask for a better opportunity to talk to somebody as we start off this 2026 years, and congratulations on everything that's been going on at the Beacon.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And thank you for just kind of being a really instrumental part of the Beacon as well. So I appreciate
As
you.
I say to anybody listening, like, hey, I do what I can. I do what I can. I do something. I do something. But yeah, thanks to everybody. And, yes, as we kind of head into the mid-January, wishing everybody a powerful, let's say this, how about this? Powerful new year in 2026. Let's keep it together. Let's keep on moving. And here we go. All right, everybody. We'll be seeing you soon. Looking for the next episode of The Beacon coming up soon. Cyril, have a great one, and I'll be talking to you soon.
You too, Kevin. This has been The Signal, a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Cyril Mychalejko, editor-in-chief and host. For more progressive news, analysis, and opinion from Bucks County and beyond, go to www.buckscountybeacon.com.